Nate Diaz's stitches and face damage. When Nate Diaz stepped into the octagon against Carlos Condit at UFC 143, fans knew they were in for a war. Both fighters were known for their tough as nails mentality, and the fight didn't disappoint. From the get-go, the fight was a brutal exchange. Condit came out with his striking, landing sharp elbows and fists that cut Diaz open early. But it wasn't just about the cuts. It was the sheer amount of blood that began to pour from Diaz's face. But Diaz, ever the warrior, kept moving forward, never once backing down. By the third round, his face was barely recognizable, but despite the severe damage, he kept pushing forward, constantly taunting Condit and looking for openings, all while dealing with one of the most gruesome cuts in UFC history. He endured significant cuts and swelling during his fight with Condit at UFC 143, but the bout went the distance and was decided by the judges. The fight ended in Condit's favor, but Diaz's resilience and toughness became the real story. He fought through what most would have considered a fight-ending injury, proving that for him, a little blood, or a lot, wasn't going to stop him from going the distance. That fight against Condit was a clear reminder of just how far Nate Diaz is willing to go in the octagon. Anderson Silva's leg break. On December 28, 2013, Anderson Silva's reign as the UFC middleweight champion came crashing down in the most unimaginable way. He'd been dominant for years with a record-breaking title defense streak, but his rematch with Chris Weidman at UFC 168 would go down in history for all the wrong reasons. The fight was close, with Silva looking to reclaim his title after losing it to Weidman in their first encounter. With just minutes left in the second round, Silva threw a leg kick, one he'd perfected over the years, but this time something went horribly wrong. As Silva's shin collided with Weidman's knee, the sound of his leg snapping echoed through the arena. Fans gasped as Silva collapsed to the canvas, his leg bent in an impossible angle. The immediate aftermath was nothing short of horrific. Silva, writhing in pain, knew his career had just taken a devastating turn. His leg, broken in two places, would require multiple surgeries and months of grueling rehabilitation. The shockwave of Silva's injury spread beyond the cage. The entire UFC community was left in disbelief, and his legacy was forever altered. He'd never return to his former dominant self. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd seen others suffer similar fates had now become the victim of one of the most gruesome injuries in MMA history. T.J. Dillashaw's shoulder. On January 19, 2019, T.J. Dillashaw challenged Henry Cejudo for the UFC flyweight title at UFC Fight Night 143. Dillashaw lost by technical knockout in the first round. He entered the fight with a shoulder injury, but did not lose his bantamweight title in this bout. He had been a dominant bantamweight champion, and the matchup with Cejudo was seen as a high-stakes battle. From the start, he was aggressive, pushing the pace and doing what he does best. But as the fight progressed, something was clearly wrong. TJ, already compromised by a shoulder injury, was struggling to hold up under the pressure of the fight. Despite the pain, he continued to move forward, looking for openings and throwing his signature strikes. But by the end of the first round, it was clear his injury was catching up to him. By the end of the first round, his shoulder injury was clearly affecting his performance. Cejudo capitalized and finished Dillashaw by technical knockout in the first round. He didn't lose his bantamweight title in this fight. He lost a flyweight title challenge. The aftermath included a long recovery from injury. Kevin Randleman's punch on Mirko Cro Cop. On April 9, 2004, the Pride Fighting Championships brought two of the most feared fighters together, Kevin Randleman and Mirko Cro Cop. The fight was set to be an intense clash of styles, but it quickly turned into one of the most unforgettable moments in MMA history. Randleman, known for his raw power in wrestling, had Cro Cop in a dangerous position. What happened next would change the course of both fighters' careers. In Pride Total Elimination 2004, Kevin Randleman shocked the MMA world by knocking out Mirko Cro Cop in the first round with a powerful left hook. What followed was pure chaos. The sound was sickening and the crowd gasped in unison. Cro Cop was out cold, his body limp on the mat, while Randleman stood in disbelief at what had just unfolded. It wasn't just a punch, it was a reminder of the brutal, unpredictable violence that makes the sport so dangerous. Frank Mirs' broken arm. On December 10, 2011, UFC 140 delivered one of the most disturbing moments in the history of the sport. Frank Mir was not on the receiving end of a broken arm, but he was the one who broke Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira's arm with a Kimura submission at NFC 140. What started as a tactical battle quickly became a nightmare for Nogueira, whose arm would be broken in one of the most brutal displays of MMA grappling. In the first round, Mir locked in an armbar, a move he was famous for. Nogueira, as tough as they come, refused to tap out. The tension in the arena was palpable as Mir torqued his opponent's arm to its breaking point. Then, with a sickening crack, Nogueira's arm snapped in two places. The noise was unmistakable, sending chills through the crowd. Mir released the hold immediately, his face twisted in disbelief as he saw the damage. Nogueira, ever the warrior, grimaced in pain but refused to quit. but the injury was too severe, and the referee called a halt to the fight. His arm was a mangled mess, a horrifying sight that would forever change his career. For Mir, this victory added another notch to his legacy as one of the most feared submission artists in UFC history. Before Nogueira, this was a devastating reminder of the brutal consequences of MMA. The injury was more than just physical, it marked the end of his prime. Chris Weidman's leg break. Weidman was looking to prove he was still a force in the UFC middleweight division when he faced Uriah Hall at UFC 261. As a former champion, he was hungry to regain his title aspirations after a few years of ups and downs. But what was supposed to be a fight to revive his career turned into one of the most horrifying moments in UFC history. Just minutes into the fight, Weidman went for a leg kick, a move he'd perfected over the years, but as his leg made contact with Hall's shin, disaster struck. The force of the impact caused Weidman's leg to snap in a way no one expected. The sickening sound of his leg breaking was unmistakable, and his body crumpled to the canvas. Weidman immediately fell to the ground, writhing in pain as his shin bent at a grotesque angle. The crowd went silent. Evan Hall, who was moments away from potentially securing a knockout, looked horrified by the injury. Referee Herb Dean stepped in immediately, halting the fight as the medical team rushed to Weidman's side. The image of Weidman's broken leg became a chilling reminder of the violence and brutality that comes with the sport. The injury was eerily similar to the one Anderson Silva suffered against Weidman in 2013. It marked the end of Weidman's middleweight championship aspirations, and with it, another painful chapter in the career of a once dominant fighter. Brock Lesnar's diverticulitis. His battle with diverticulitis is one of the most heartbreaking stories in UFC history, not because of a fight night injury, but because of the impact an illness had on his career. Lesnar, the former UFC heavyweight champion, was dominating the sport when he faced Cain Velasquez at UFC 121. The fight was hyped up as the ultimate clash of power versus skill, but what fans didn't know was that Lesnar was struggling with a severe health issue that would drastically affect his performance. Leading up to his fight, Lesnar had been dealing with some severe abdominal pain. Doctors diagnosed him with diverticulitis, a condition where pouches form in the intestines and become infected. Lesnar was in agonizing pain, but he pushed forward, determined to fight. The illness, however, took its toll on his body, and it was clear from the start of the fight that something was off. Velasquez took advantage, relentlessly pressuring Lesnar and eventually winning the fight by TKO in the first round. His performance was lackluster, and it was apparent that the illness had drained him of the strength he was known for. After the loss, it was revealed that Lesnar had been battling diverticulitis for months, even needing surgery to remove part of his colon. For Lesnar, the illness was more than just a physical setback, it was a career-altering blow. The disease forced him to take a break from the sport and forever changed the trajectory of his MMA career. Chuck Liddell's KO loss. Chuck Liddell, the iconic UFC light heavyweight champion, was the face of the sport for years. Known for his knockout power and relentless fighting style, he was untouchable in his prime. Liddell had already suffered knockout losses to Rashad Evans in 2008 and Mauricio Shogun Rua in 2009 before facing Franklin. The fight ended in the first round with Franklin knocking out Liddell. The fight started like many of Liddell's battles, fast-paced, aggressive, with both fighters trading punches. But Liddell, now well into his 40s, wasn't moving the way he used to. His legendary chin, which had taken countless hits throughout his career, was finally showing signs of wear. In the first round, Franklin caught Liddell with a perfect counter right hook that sent Liddell crashing to the canvas, unconscious before he even hit the ground. The crowd fell silent as the referee rushed in to stop the fight. Liddell lay motionless for a moment, his eyes wide open, but clearly out cold. This loss marked the beginning of a slow decline and the end of an era for MMA's biggest star. Diego Sanchez's deep forehead cut. His battle with BJ Penn at UFC 107 wasn't just a fight, it became a grueling test of willpower and pain tolerance. Sanchez was known for his relentless, never-back-down style, and this fight was supposed to be the pinnacle of his career. But things would take a shocking turn that would leave fans and fighters alike stunned. The fight began as expected, intense, fast-paced, with both fighters giving it their all. But as the rounds went on, Sanchez began showing signs that something was seriously wrong. Midway through the fight, Sanchez fought Penn at UFC 107 and lost by TKO due to a doctor stoppage in the 5th round after suffering a deep cut on his forehead. However, he did what only a fighter with his heart would do. He kept pushing through the pain. The fight wasn't stopped at the end of the 3rd round. Diego Sanchez versus BJ Penn at UFC 107 was stopped by doctor's intervention in the 5th round due to a deep cut on Sanchez's forehead. It was a harsh lesson in the physical toll of the sport. The deep cut forced him to reconsider his future in MMA, but his refusal to quit, even with an injury that would have ended most people's careers, solidified his legacy as one of the toughest fighters ever to compete inside the octagon. McDonald's face destruction. UFC 109 was billed as one of the greatest fights in the sport's history. and it lived up to every bit of that hype when Rory McDonald and Robbie Lawler met in the octagon for the welterweight title. What followed was a brutal back-and-forth battle, but it wasn't just the punches that made this fight unforgettable. It was the absolute destruction of McDonald's face. From the very beginning, both fighters went all in. McDonald with his technical precision and Lawler with his raw power traded shots in a fight that had fans on the edge of their seats. But as the rounds wore on, McDonald's face became a bloody mess. His nose was broken, his face swelling rapidly from the punishing strikes Lawler was landing. But it wasn't just the surface damage. McDonald's spirit was being crushed too. In the fifth round, McDonald's face was nearly unrecognizable. Blood was pouring from his nose, his cuts deep and vicious. But despite the horror that was unfolding before the audience's eyes, he never quit. He continued to press forward, throwing punches and trying to land that one big shot, but it wasn't enough. Lawler seized the opportunity, landing a devastating punch that sealed the fight and gave him the title. His toughness became legendary after that night. Edgar's bruises. Edgar's title defense against Gray Maynard at UFC 125 was one of the most dramatic fights in UFC history, not just because of the back-and-forth action, but because of the brutal punches that defined the battle. In the first round, Maynard came out swinging with everything he had. Edgar, the defending champion, was dropped twice and seemed on the verge of losing it all. But despite the clear punishment, Edgar kept coming forward, refusing to go down. By the second round, his resilience was already being tested to its limits. His head was snapping back with every punch from Maynard, and it looked like the fight would be over soon. But somehow, despite being rocked, Edgar dug deep and regained his composure. Then came the fourth round, where both fighters were still exchanging vicious blows, with neither willing to give an inch. The real story was in the fifth round. Edgar, battered and bruised, was determined to make it through. With each powerful shot, his chances of survival seemed slimmer and slimmer. Yet somehow, in an incredible display of determination, he managed to survive the onslaught and keep fighting. In the end, the judges ruled it a draw, but for Edgar, the real win was the heart he displayed. His toughness in the face of that brutal fight left fans and fighters alike in awe, proving that sometimes sheer willpower is just as important as skill in MMA. So now, after witnessing these jaw-dropping injuries, it begs the question, how far are these fighters willing to push their bodies for glory? Drop your thoughts below as you like the video and subscribe for more.